You can actually start the session. Meanwhile, you can join. Okay, he's on his way. Okay, well.
So the topic is actually future city.
Everyone, please settle down. The session has started.
It's a very open subject. So. Yes.
So
Attention, everyone, please settle down.
I very warmly welcome you to the last session of the day, and we have the good fortune of having Mr. P.K. Das with us, a renowned architect who is based in Bombay, but he also visits Odisha quite frequently and is associated with many ambitious projects here. And he also edits Question of the City, a very famous web journal, which has many readers and has many footprints. So today we are talking about a subject which exercises the mind of almost everyone, because cities are extremely important for everyone. Not only today, but even historically, cities have defined a certain idea, certain way of looking at the world. For instance, even in Christianity, the very word, for instance, civilization, is actually based on the word city. Civitas means city. Or metropolis, polis in politics is again based on the Greek word polis, which means city. So much so that in Christianity, when Saint Augustine thinks of the city of God, he thinks of city of God, not a village of God. So the idea is that city is a metaphor. City is an idea of organized living, and it's associated with progress, associated with all kinds of structure. Living. So, and Raymond Williams, a very famous Marxist thinker, he wrote a famous book called titled "Country and the City." That there is this almost irreversible movement from country to the city. That at a particular point in 19th century, the number of people living in the cities exceeded the number of people living in the villages. So that was a turning point in the history of at least British society, that suddenly cities came to dominate the cultural and economic and social landscape. Living in a city became synonymous with progress, synonymous with modernity. So we can't imagine modernity without cities. We can't imagine modernity in a village. So automatically, the moment we talk about a modern world, we think of a city. But cities also are associated with many things that are considered negative, because say chaos or violence or impersonality, anonymity. So that's why I think I'm a layman, but I would venture to say Louis Mumford talks about an organic city, because cities are supposed to be divorced from nature. So increasingly cities represent a kind of alienation from the natural world, and therefore present a threat to sustainable futures of humanity. So in this context, now that everyone wants to live in a city and cities are expanding and cities present unique crisis, I think now that we have such a distinguished architect and thinker like Mr. Das, the future cities, what should be the shape of, or what shape future cities are going to take, and what shapes they should have. So I would request Mr. Das to reflect on this and enlighten us on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Naik. You brought up 2 points which I think are very important when you were speaking. One is, as I understand it, I keep saying this, that cities were perceived. Hello? Hello? Yeah, I think you brought up 2 very important points on which I'll dwell and then get into further to make further points. Cities, as I explained, were perceived to be zones of liberation and freedom. When people migrated, moved to cities, they came together. For the first time in cities, the working people began to come together, to gather together, to put up common demands. So the whole idea of collectivization, the idea of democracy, the idea of togetherness actually began sort of with the making of the cities. And truly, therefore, cities were for the working people considered as zones of liberation, of freedom. That's one important point you made, which I'll come to a bit later when I'll be dwelling on other points. But the second point that you made, which is very important and where I will start really with, is when you mentioned and talked about Louis Mumford, where for the first time, cities were seen as areas that were disassociated from nature. And that, my God, today is probably the biggest crisis of cities. That disassociation of cities, or rather people, I would say, or city people, or cities and people, from the idea of nature, has come to a point where we are today not threatened, but we are confronted by anthropogenic shifts in through climate change crisis that we experience today. Significant shifts in the climate and the planetary conditions that we are threatened by today. So I'll kind of start dwelling on the second point first, and then I'll sort of open up for further, points from you both. I'm not making any big statements. I'm not sort of saying that this is the truth, but these are questions that we are very seriously and critically confronted by, and hence the inquiry. And hence an inquiry through collective effort, not by individual effort, but by collective effort, because we've realized how individual efforts destroy the idea of collectivization and monopolizes and colonizes, etc., etc. So urban ecology is what I've been trying to work on since over 15 or 20 years. I'm an architect by qualification. I'm trained to build more, build as much as I can, the thirst and the hunger to build more, to express my capacity, my power, my, etc., etc., and build through these monoblocks and edifices to leave landmarks in the city. I'm hungry to do that. But over the past 15, 20 years, I've been thinking otherwise. Can we build less? Can we build with nature? Can we intertwine our buildings and urban scapes and the imagery of cities with nature? Can nature-based planning and design become the thrust of city planning and hence the future of cities? Now, this is a very, very important aspect that we really have to understand very, very carefully and closely. What does urban ecology really mean? When I say ecology, I'm not referring to natural ecology disassociated from people. I'm referring to urban ecology as a people, the state of people and nature relationship. It's not just about people and nature relationships. It then questions us about the state of people-people relationship. What is the state of relationship between people that is beginning to, which we surface, which we experience now, extreme conditions of polarization, hatred, of exclusion, of seclusion, discrimination, be it on gender basis, be it on caste, be it on religion, race, and so forth. We devise weapons and means to start polarizing people. So we have to also talk about this very critical condition or state of the relationship of people with people. As a prerequisite, necessarily as a prerequisite, to collectively then have a dialogue of developing our relationships collectively and together with nature. So this is the premise on which I have been sort of working for the past 15, 20 years, and somebody may find this very peculiar that here I'm on one hand trying to build, on the other hand trying to question buildings and to cut down and downsize buildings. The second point that comes from, and why is this relationship is important? Why is this relationship so critical today? We talked about climate crisis, the kind of critical anthropogenic shifts that are happening. It is no more a threat. It has already entered our houses, threatening our very structures of places we built and our relationships and our economies and everything else that you have. By the way, the maximum deaths in the world are due to climate change. It even far exceeds the deaths that happened during the 2 years of COVID that we were so deeply concerned about. Of course, that was an issue of concern, undoubtedly. But this is an ongoing process of people losing lives. And Kofi Annan, when he was the General Secretary of the United Nations, has actually brought out a very interesting document on this, of the numbers of death that continuously happen for climate victims, including climate migration, being the largest migration anywhere in the world, far exceeds drought and cyclonic effects, etc., etc. So the question then comes about sustainability. How do we re-envision our cities? On what grounds do we re-envision our cities to achieve sustainability? And to my mind, the crux of sustainability, the bottom line, is this deep relationship, which is actually interdependent and inseparable. But through our so-called development policies and norms and colonization of public assets through various means by private sector, by private agencies, we have been segregated from one another, and we are segregated in that process from nature. So on one hand, attack on people. On the other hand, attack on biodiversity and nature. Destroying natural areas. For example, we are destroying forests, we are destroying creeks, rivers, wetlands, mangroves. Orissa is an incredible example of the destruction of mangroves and what havoc it has caused. And this is established science, that the coastline of Orissa and the entire state of Orissa is in fact today extremely vulnerable to the uncertainty and intensity of cyclonic winds and rains due to one of the causes is due to the destruction of the mangroves along the coastlines of Orissa. Now, that's on one hand. On the other hand, I've quite talked about this, but this is extremely important. We people living in cities are now some of the worst sufferers of climate crisis. Just by giving one simple example, I will take this point forward. I'm citing the idea or the fact of heat island effect. Why I'm bringing this point up is interestingly, because this is directly related to the act of building more, the hunger to build more in cities. Heat island effect is what I do not need to explain, is now experienced by one and all. The rising temperature, as an example. Odisha is no more unfamiliar to temperatures rise up to 50 degrees centigrade. Mumbai is reaching 40, 42, 43 degrees temperatures. There are other parts which are equally rising world over. Heat island effect happens because of concretization, because of construction. At two levels, broadly speaking, at two levels. A, by building more buildings in a city, which are densely packed, leaving no ground open space for trees or vegetation, or even grounds to soak the rainwater and feed the earth of its nutrients that support trees and other flora and fauna, or the vegetation. On the other hand, it is our notions of development through extreme conditions of concretization by way of building highways, roads, more and more flyovers, which causes more and more congestion, we are aware of, an extreme state of concretization. But this takes me to a third very important point, is transport, mobility. I just talked about more flyovers, more roads, which is leading to concretizing of surfaces of the earth. But you, therefore, in that process, have two things happening. We are becoming more and more private cars dependent, mobility oriented people. Our increased dependency on private transport must be given up to promoting public transport. But in Indian cities, I'm not talking about international experience, as many cities internationally are reversing some of their processes. We are going exactly what they did in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, is to build more highways and depend on more cars, private cars. And we are actually killing public transport, as Mumbai is doing with BEST, which is probably one of the finest examples of public transport in India, for example. On the other hand, the concretization story doesn't, transport of course is an important aspect. We are concretizing our rivers, our natural areas. It is a fashion after the Ahmedabad River Development Project to champion that model of riverfront development across municipal corporations of this country. And there's a race amongst engineers to concretize rivers, to canalize rivers, to disassociate water from earth, to disassociate what is inseparable, the natural relationships that exist between water, earth, and other biodiversity conditions. So here is therefore the story that has led to what I have, studies have established, and this is a very serious urban study, that heat island effect is causing what's called heat stress. And heat stress manifests in affecting the state of mental and physical health conditions of people. Now, this is very serious. It's affecting our own health. And we are beginning to invest more or spend more on health care, treating conditions that could easily be avoided, which are triggered by the fact of heat island effect. So heat stress has led to a point. I was attending a conference, or rather I was speaking at a conference in Delhi, where some of the top surgeons and doctors of the country were actually speaking about urbanization and health. And some of these specialists talked about how all the vital organs of people are now deeply affected, critically affected, because of heat stress and because of air pollution. We used to think lung is the only one that gets affected by, by bad quality air, but it affects the heart, it affects the kidney, it affects the liver. So here we are at a situation where these issues have to be talked about. And I, as an architect, am deeply engaged with these questions, obviously, because I was one who was trying to interfere the most in severing these inseparable relationships that sustain our lives and the planet. And so I have some ideas which I'm putting forward to further discussion about understanding of architecture, understanding of planning, understanding of design, And one of the things that I've been talking about, which I think Professor Naik talked about in the very first session today, is design beyond borders, beyond boundaries. And this is a very critical aspect in urban planning, because what we do is we start with the plot and quickly first build a big wall around it. And we exclude ourselves from the neighbor and from everybody else and the city. And we think of then our building or a building as a product and how to well package and market it. We turn a building to a commodity. We turn our habitation as a product to be sold and transacted in the market. And this notion of transaction and profit and of commodity and consumption then completes the story that we started with of segregating and severing these relationships. So I've been trying to define architectural practice and how it can breach boundaries through many, many ways, which I will not get into right now. In several projects, we're trying to do this, and we've done that in certain projects of breaching boundaries. The second, of course, is ecology-based planning. Now, when we talk about plants, trees, and ecology or biodiversity, this is not about manicuring gardens, not about decorative landscapes. That must be given up, because we travel somewhere, we try and pick up that plant from there and try and plant it here. And we kill the native plants and flora and fauna. Weeds, grass, water, cesspools, these are extremely important aspects of biodiversity that support each other's lives. And so we have to start thinking how ecology-based landscapes must now define the aesthetics of our cities, where buildings are discrete behind trees. Tree as a single element of nature, to me, is a metaphor. A tree that we must not just protect, but grow as much as
perspective on the crisis confronting cities, and also making us hear a voice of sanity, because you made so many constructive suggestions regarding what can be done. It's not, you simply didn't You didn't simply portray a bleak picture of cities facing a crisis, but what could be done about combating the calamity that looming before us. So I would now request Michael to reflect upon some of the points made by Mr. Das, because you have experience of urbanization in Netherlands and also you live in a howling metropolis like Bangalore. So can
Just to add a line before he takes over, he comes from a country that we today read a lot and try to adapt and follow of the measures they have taken on
we can-
sustainability measures.
so we can learn a lot from his observations.
Well, is it working? Yeah. Oh, yes. Is this one better? Yeah, I think so, right? Yeah, so I don't know if I'm the right person to reflect on most of what you said, and I'm certainly not a scholar of urban planning in the Netherlands. I think I know more about Indian cities than I know about Dutch cities. So I spent part of my life in Bangalore, and I'm an anthropologist. I'm an urban anthropologist. That's my field. Definitely not an architect, although, you know, it's a field that I find very interesting. But I can share a little bit from an anthropological point of view of how I've seen Bangalore change in the past roughly quarter of a century that I've been coming there. From first time that I came to Bangalore, it was a city of roughly 5 million people. It was the fifth, maybe sixth largest city in India. And it was already being lamented of, the old Bangalore had disappeared. The new Bangalore had come in its wake due to the IT industry. So old Bangaloreans were already complaining that the old city was gone. I've published on this, I've written about this. This is a narrative about a city that continues. People are still complaining about that. New successive generations more or less say the same about Bangalore as they did 20 years ago. It's one of these things, I guess, about cities is that they are incredibly dynamic places with successive generations having particular feelings about them. But coming to and what I find so fascinating about Indian cities and what sets them apart from most other cities in the world is the speed with which they've grown in the past few decades. And Bangalore is one such example. From 5 million people 20 years ago, it's gone to 15 million in 20 years' time. So it's tripled in size. And you feel that, even for me as a foreigner, as a newcomer, and I always think of myself that way, is I can kind of sort of see and relate to that. And with that has come climate change. If I look at my family home, which once was located on the outskirts of Bangalore, but has now since then become inskirts in many ways, with a Starbucks, a McDonald's, a KFC around the corner, multiple supermarkets, multiple biological produced supermarkets, as we also have. So typically also very much an upper middle class neighborhood, but also the fact that 20 years ago, none of us had air conditioning inside these homes because Bangalore was still known as a natural air-conditioned city. These days, that's long stopped. And just the other day, my father-in-law, who's also in his late 70s, he was complaining about the heat, and he hates the ceiling fans. But kind of sort of what you mentioned, and I would love to hear you say more about that because I think you're far more knowledgeable about that, is something that immediately occurred to me about how do we intervene in cities? How do we make them more livable when we kind of know that they've become more uninhabitable over the past few decades? So that's something I've seen firsthand in a city like Bangalore, but also in my native Amsterdam, where I grew up in a gray, rainy, cold country where increasingly people also have air conditioning in their homes because also our summers have become warmer. Recently, the newspaper reported on that the Netherlands now has the summer climate of the south of France of my childhood. And for your point of reference, I'm from 1975, so I'm 50 now. And when I was young, our parents would take us to the south of France on holiday for summer holidays because that's where you would get the good weather. That's the kind of weather we now have in the Netherlands, and that has provoked people to install air conditioning in their houses in the Netherlands. So it's not just a thing of India. But one thing, and I'll go back to you because you have far more interesting things to say that way, is I was reminded of this book by James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State. And it's required reading for anthropology students in the Netherlands and probably the world over. He's a very renowned urban anthropologist and scholar of borders. He passed away a few years ago. And he actually has a whole chapter dedicated not just to Chandigarh, where he also draws parallels to this city, Bhubaneswar, because Bhubaneswar is a typical example of urban city planning, which has radically intervened in a particular way of building cities. But he is also super critical. Seeing Like a State draws upon the idea of the state looks down with mathematical precision, tries to intervene in human life. But human life has a way of organizing and doing its own thing. So maybe returning to you, what I would really be curious to hear from, how do you think we could intervene in this? How could we make these cities more livable in a concrete way without kind of superimposing a particular plan on them that is as radical as Chandigarh or Bhubaneswar once was?
Well, there are just 2 points that I picked up from both of you. Professor Naik, you talked about how can we combat these climate crisis conditions, and that's a word I'm very worried about. Yeah. It's a military metaphor. It's exactly what we are talking against. Is taming nature, is regulating and controlling nature and combating nature. So we've gone ahead in building what's called the sea walls to prevent floods. But the sea rises and walls have to keep going up forever. But that's no way of regulating. So we can't combat the forces of nature. Oh, yeah, well, Netherlands is, I'll come to Netherlands and Germany as examples on measures of sustainability. But surely that's not the solution. So that's one word. I mean, I'm sort of not getting to elaborate that. But the other point that you raised up, or you kind of ended with, is a point that I was to pick up. And that's one of my favorite parts of my talks anywhere, is the need to collectively intervene to influence change. And that is the crux of the matter. Who brings this change? Who leads the change? And who's who? There are many questions within these questions. Now, when you say we are all the time some exclusive group of people. I am interested about the excluded people who are the worst sufferers of climate crisis. The poor, the working people, and the excluded minority communities are world over the worst affected due to climate crisis. I'm interested in that part because that's the majority of people. So I will not get into elaborating we further, but we have to be extremely careful when we are using these words and metaphors. Like we say, people. It's our way of looking at people and relating to people. There's this very interesting book by John Berger called Ways of Seeing. We don't see what we look at. We choose to see what we can relate to. And so we relate to you, her, he, him, and that becomes my people. And our voices then becomes people's voice, cutting out the majority of voices who are the worst victims of all development and climate crisis. So this is an interesting sort of, points for discussion to be critical about. I, as an architect, have been grappling how, in my design work, which is so physical, and it has to be physical because ultimately I believe, and I've come to understand, to a certain point, at least in my architectural practice, spanning over 45 years now, based in Mumbai, that building design or city planning is a manifestation of multiple things. It's cultures, ideologies, perceptions, aspirations, and importantly, a political ideology. And that governs the nature of city planning and design. We are open, but open between each other. But our open with each other has led to exclusion of many. How can we address this at a larger level? How can we, therefore the question rests, how can we build robust people's organizations and their networks? Now these networks are important. These networks brings you to the point of de-walling cities in physical terms. It's a metaphorical term, de-walling cities, as I kept saying. And how do we network? How do we bring people together, not for unification, but to achieve unity in diversity of thoughts, of minds, of cultures, of practices, of ideologies? These are the challenges for which there will be never a single answer by an authority or a dictator, sometimes whom we love and we celebrate for being decisive. But those decisive moments are moments of severe oppression and exclusion. And we have to be extremely careful about these political and social processes that affects the physical manifestation. So when I'm drawing now or I'm designing a building, I'm actually very, very frightened, to be honest with you. For 20 years back, I was never as frightened. And I produced 50 buildings in 10 years. Now I'm producing just about 4 or 5 buildings in 10 years. Because I'm downsizing my clients. I'm unable to now relate to a patron who's an oppressor, who's a colonizer, who is demolishing what I call, and this is a very serious matter, common property resources. The depletion of common property resources is a point I'm leaving with again, but it's a very vital subject, that how common property resources idea is being depleted and being downsized with time through the process of through the process of city building and colonization of public resources for private profit. Now, I just stopped using a word, urbanization, halfway, and shifted to city building or city making. I have been, over the years, come to differentiate the act of city making or city building from the process of urbanization. Urbanization is a process of liberation, not liberalization, liberation, of freedom, of equality, not unification, equality in diversity, and so on and so forth. And cities were those hopeful grounds, those promised land of freedom, of liberty, of collectivization. How can I, through now city planning and architecture, stitch the fissured land? That's the biggest challenge we are all confronted at various levels of thinking and work and engagements that we are into.
I think this is a layman's question. I know very little about architecture, and it was a great learning experience when I heard you talk about so many aspects of the challenges facing us. In India, certain attempts were made in the past. I can think of Laurie Baker's attempt to integrate nature and urbanization or bring certain concerns, pressing concerns with nature into architectural planning. And so why did this fail, or why didn't these attempts didn't acquire the kind of momentum that that they could have acquired? So just a layman's question. I know nothing about architecture, but I have heard a lot about Laurie Baker and why did his experiments fail when he was trying to maintain a balance, strike a balance between nature and urbanization.
Um, is it working? Is it? Yeah, okay. So one of the reasons from social science is you see that it fails is often because of a model. So the model is implemented on a social reality, and then it turns out the social reality, the social cultural reality on the ground turns out to be much more complex. So returning to the book I just mentioned by James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State, actually starts with German interventions in forestry and trying to kind of industrialize forestry. And then we quickly find out, and it relates to the ways of seeing that you just flagged as well, which is a big momentum also in anthropology right now through what we call multi-species anthropology, is that the reality has many more beings in it with agency and determination. So not just us having a certain preference, where you see, for instance, Chandigarh being designed, a typical product of Le Corbusier or Brasilia, which was by a Brazilian architect. What's his name? Yeah, so, so that this idea that we could organize all of that in a certain way and it would be an ideal city. And then in practice, actually, that didn't work. One of the reasons, for instance, that Brasilia, which I visited a few years ago, is still a beautifully kept city in many ways, but it's also a very unflexible one, because once you've designed it, you can't really change anything about it. And in a sense, you see the same with Chandigarh. Even though it works at a certain level, because I still think quality of life is quite high in Chandigarh compared to other cities, but it is also deeply segregated in many ways. So quality of high is mainly for the upper middle classes who can afford to live in the more comfortable pockets, but the rest of the city that has grown and sprawled around it is very differently organized. So coming back to that simple question of why does it often fail, is that the model can't really take into account all these different smaller things that make livability and also make all our collective choices where we like to live, like having a particular village square. Like Corbusier really wanted that eradicated from cities, right? He didn't want nice little squares where we would all come together and have our social lives take place. He wanted to have that all ordered, and he wanted to have that connected by gigantic highways, but that kind of required everybody to have a car, which not everybody can afford. And if you've ever been to Chandigarh, you realize the complexity that comes with, because if you have to cycle down these not so tree shaded lanes, you'll feel that on the top of your head, the sun burning down. One thing that I was also reminded of, and we're here in the end to talk about books, coming back a little bit to what you said earlier, which is a concern I share with you, the heat island or the heat bubble that we're all feeling. Like, I just came from Bangalore. Bangalore had 37 degrees in March. It's ridiculous. I mean, it shouldn't have happened. You're really feeling it, right? You're feeling it. But I can take shelter of that. But the book I was reminded of that really extrapolates on this, which has fundamentally changed my way of thinking, a novel, is Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, because it actually is an American writer, but the story starts in India. It starts in the north towards, Punjab, Haryana, I don't know exactly. And it's a person who ends up in a heat bubble, and then a lot of people die. And that's the starting point of a novel where he tries to think about what positive change could that in the end have for the way we start thinking about our planetary future. And I think that is quite crucial in all of this, is that we need to start thinking much more in terms of planetary consequences and us all inhabiting one in which these cities are indeed where we all live. And so Ministry for the Future, as a way to think what our future might look like and how that might work, is one such example. I don't know if you're familiar with the novel, but I think it's a very crucial example of that, where we, in kind of writing and in speculative fiction in particular, kind of see this way of thinking moved forward, how we could intervene in all of this.
Well, I think he's kind of answered your point about Laurie Baker. This reminds me of a very interesting incident in Latur in Maharashtra post the earthquake. As you know, Maharashtra was hit by this enormous earthquake, and thousands of villages went down in the districts of Osmanabad and Latur and so on and so forth. And we, a group of slum dwellers, and my organization, which is a housing rights, slum dwellers based housing rights movement in Mumbai, actually led a delegation of 100 slum dwellers who for the first time ever got out of their daily woes and demands to go to Latur to help rebuild villages. And it was very interesting. We rebuilt a village called Chincholi Kate for the poorest of the poor, and the rich people of the same village. The houses, the rich people of the same village was built by the Times of India, who had excluded this population from their plan. And so we had these two rebuilding models next to each other. But that's not the point I was coming to. I was coming to another village in the neighborhood, Mr. S.K. Sharma, who then headed HUDCO and was a very dynamic man with vision of what HUDCO and urbanization must be in India, took Laurie Baker there to rebuild a village. And believe me, after 2 meetings with Laurie Baker, the villagers literally and physically threw him out of the place, out of the area. S.K. Sharma had to run with Laurie Baker out of that place because people experienced that the houses collapsed because they were made of stone and mud. And they died with the weight of the stones falling on them. And Laurie Baker was championing mud and bricks and stone. Their demand was to build pakka houses. It's another question. We can discuss whether that's a right thing or wrong thing. But people's aspirations cannot be ignored in the process. And that's when you talked about, collectively coming together. And in Germany, this thing about industrialization of forests, it just caught as an infection around the world. And then Germany post-war had not a single tree anywhere. And they started doing replantation of forests and for consumption. So coming back to the cities, it's very interesting. In the neoliberal globalization political order, cities are grounds of financial turnover and profit. And that is why David Harvey also writes that how building construction industry, therefore, in cities is the largest industry everywhere in the world and employs the most of maximum number of people. And precisely for this reason, now parallel this argument or this idea with a survey, let's say in Mumbai, where over 40% of the built apartments are lying vacant at any given point of time. And similar statistics emerge from all cities across India. Of course, depending on the scales of the cities, the figures differ, but the percentages are pretty similar. Now, why does this happen? Why did we build 30% more that remained unoccupied for speculative investments? One person investing into 5 apartments for quick turnovers at the cost of the ecology, environment, and at the cost of denying access to housing for the homeless. So this question of production, productivity, scales of operation that we witness, that Bangalore expanded tenfold, is not surprising if we actually understand the political order that dictates and demands the nature of development. So these are many, many questions. They can't be answered nor resolved in one get together or sitting, but they have to be intervened to influence change and collectively. I think that's the only point I've learned living and working in Mumbai, is to collectively intervene to influence change. And therefore, in that process of influencing change, we have to put up alternate models to challenge the mainstream model. The mainstream models can only be challenged by putting alternate models. So I think that's where I would sort of leave it at, and it's a forever evolving process of these relationships coming back to an intimate, intertwined, sustainable model. Thank you.
I think time is up, and we can take a couple of quick questions before we wind up the session. So.
Hello, sir. I'm Vedant. I'm an architect by profession. So I wanted to ask, recently Delhi released its master plan. So they shared the draft, which asked for opinions by the people of Delhi for a participatory design process. But how difficult is it for other states to have that participatory process to make a master plan?
Quickly answer this. What Delhi did is not a participatory planning. You prepare the plan and then put it on the table for response. That's one. You did not, from the inception of the start of the planning, make it an inclusionary process. So then you were standing to challenge the objections and overruling the challenge. And this is what happens in this country with every planning decision, right? They have the right to reject your appeal. So it's not a participatory process. Secondly, the planning that was undertaken was taken with a certain objective. And those objectives contradict the larger population. And so the people who even participated to respond in whatever limited way they could respond were again chosen people of a particular group or class or interest or gender who would relate to that nature of planning and nature of planning process. So there are inherent contradictions. The very system that is oppressive cannot find a solution for liberation. The very system that causes the damage cannot find a solution to repair. It has to be a change of the prevailing order.
Already 7, so I think. Yeah. Another 5 minutes. If there are any questions. Any more questions? No. No, take the mic. Perhaps they're recording the whole thing.
As a general public is see that development definitely happen in that way. But same way the public is not supporting that. Is it the right approach? What is doing it is right or wrong? That would be my question.
This has been answered in a number of times through the discussion between us. I mean, I have talked about our increased dependency on private transport, the need to increase public transport, and how highways and more roads and concretization is also contributing to climate change and heat island stress. So this has been quite elaborately discussed, actually. I'm sorry you didn't pay attention, maybe.
Yeah, so when it comes to these questions of change and organic, I mean, I've been through kind of sort of these discussions many times. The one thing I think we do need to integrate more urgently within our own mindset is that over the decades, this hasn't happened. So, in many ways, it's only been getting worse. When it comes to our climate goals, we've not met them. We've never met them. Not a single one. We're now in a political phase globally, in a planetary system where we're abandoning these. At the same time, a lot of my work as an anthropologist has been done walking across cities. When I wrote my last book, Muscular India, I walked a lot, and I know that my gender kind of helps me do that across cities. So I walked across Mumbai, I walked across Delhi, Bangalore, etc., just to experience change in the way people live. And I can afford that, right? That's already a privilege that I can do that. And by the end of the day, return to a comfortable home and cough out the dust and take a shower, and all of that works in my life. But the one thing that it has taught me over the years as an urban anthropologist is that each year it gets a little bit worse, and it gets progressively worse for those it affects the most. And that is the one thing that I keep on seeing, not just in India, but also in my own country, the Netherlands, which is ostensibly one of the wealthiest. But it's kind of a planetary thing where we keep on talking about change and how we can intervene in it, but at the same time, the reality keeps overtaking us, and that is my real concern. That really worries me, because I've seen that happen, and maybe I'll, in a sense, outlive it, my life. But how are future generations going to deal with this and find a place in that? For instance, earlier we're saying, like Mumbai, 30% of the housing unoccupied. In Amsterdam, in this period of the past 20 years, houses have become so much more expensive that for a younger generation, the house I bought as a PhD candidate cannot be afforded anymore. It's tripled in value. So these kind of realities are so stark that we're faced with a colossal problem. And I don't know how, I don't have the answers either. Okay, I didn't really leave you on a positive note, I guess, but I'm sorry about that.
That's perfect. Just to sort of add a point to what he said, I know it's very interesting now in the West or across Europe, children, once they were like 16 or 18, were literally thrown out of their homes. They used to leave and the parents used to push them out. Live separately, make your own lives, be independent. But now, with this example that you gave me, there are very interesting studies now in Europe where more and more children are coming back to try and stay with their parents because they can't afford any longer to be independent. So these are very interesting sociological phenomena that happens with the material, implications through all of that. So these realities have to be confronted. But to answer the last question that you raised, we have to still not give up. We can never give up. Okay, so that's Javed Akhtar's dialogue in Sholay. Jo haar gaya, wo mar gaya.
Well, that was a very rich conversation. All good things come to end. So we have to wind up the session. And Michael, please come and walk through Bhubaneswar and write a book. Yes. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the amazing session. Now I invite Madhusmita ma'am to present a token of appreciation to our esteemed guests.
You deserve it more than I do.
Because you walk cities.
I walk cities.
Right.
Thank you.
Someone walked through Bhubaneswar for a year.
So this is
My God, what number of collections you have,
I have visited 5 today.
and you have still 2 more days to go. One second.
Please.
Come back. Tragic. Thank you. Thank you.
Seeing you again. Keep seeing me until you reach.
I do have answer from Asha. She's only coming in. Yeah. So
That's all for today's sessions. Now let's move on to the cultural program which will be held at the Fakir Mohan Central Hall. Please make sure you're on your way there, where a wonderful musical performance awaits you. Thank you once again, and we'll see you at the cultural program. Thank you, everyone. खत्म है, wrap up करो।